As a collector, and sometimes writer of ghost stories, one of the most frequent questions I've been asked over the years is, "Have you ever seen a ghost?" To which I have to reply in all honesty, no. Having said that, however, I shall tell you of an experience I had nearly 30 years ago that I can't explain. The following events happened to myself and my friend Chris. In those days, I lived in a shoddy one-room bedsit in the east coast town of Skegness. By contrast, my friend Chris lived on the very edge of the Gibraltar Point Nature Reserve, a beauty spot a few miles outside of the town. Then, as now, I enjoyed going for long solitary walks in the countryside, but in those days it was one of the few ways of escaping the claustrophobia of my tiny bedsit and the hordes of noisy holidaymakers that crowded the streets and pubs of Skegness during the busy summer months. One evening, on one of my solitary outings, I found myself near the golf course to the south of the town. Beyond it lay a long, narrow, unlit road leading to the Gibraltar Point Nature Reserve. It was starting to get dark, and a thick mist was rolling in from the sea, but without thinking of time or distance, I decided to press on for the reserve. As I have mentioned, Chris lived on the very edge of the nature reserve, and since I was heading that way, I decided to call him from a nearby phone box to ask him if he would care to join me on my evening meander. As luck would have it, Chris was at home. He had nothing better to do, so it was arranged that he would set off and meet up with me on the road roughly halfway to the reserve. I continued at a brisk pace, and soon the last of the street lights receded into the distance behind me, while ahead lay a dark, narrow, uninviting road, made less inviting by an ever-worsening fog. After walking some distance, the fog became so bad that my visibility had decreased to only a few feet, and I could not distinguish the road from the verge. Concerned by the obvious dangers posed by traffic, I started to regret undertaking such a pointless and increasingly hazardous journey. I would have certainly turned back, if it were not for the knowledge that by now Chris was somewhere on the road up ahead. I stopped for a while to find my bearings, and it was then that I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy hoofbeats. Fast approaching. Who on earth was out riding a horse in this weather, I thought. And as the galloping got nearer, I felt the first intimations of fear. I was on the narrowest section of the road, and I was sure the horse and its reckless rider would be able to see me in the dense fog. So in my panic, I stumbled blindly onto the verge, aware that each faltering step I took could send me tumbling into a barbed wire fence, or worse, a deep water-filled ditch. I stood motionless as the hoofbeats thundered past. The sound was so close to me now that despite the fog, I could see exactly where the horse should have been, but there was nothing. As the galloping receded into the distance, I resumed my journey feeling both puzzled and unnerved by the experience. I pressed on till I almost collided with a figure in the fog walking in the opposite direction. It was Chris. He was equally shaken, as he just had exactly the same experience further up the road. But our conversation was interrupted when the ethereal sounds of hoofbeats returned. But this time, the drumming of the hoofbeats now seemed to be circling us at an impossible speed, getting louder and louder one moment, and then fading into the distance the next. Not wishing to hang around a moment longer, we headed back to Chris's house as fast as the going would allow us. Later we puzzled over the incident. We were in no doubt that we had both heard a horse in full gallop out there on the road. Yet there was nothing to account for it. At length, however, we decided that the fog had played tricks on our judgment of distance, and in time the incident was all but forgotten. That is until some 12 years later, when I was now living in Lincoln and working as a city tour guide. One afternoon I was swatting up on local history in the reference section of the public library, when by chance I came across a cutting from an unspecified publication that provided one possible, tantalizing clue to the mystery. You can imagine my surprise when I read the following. A legend dating from the 1700s has it that a farmer on his way home from Gibraltar Point to Skegness Market tried to take his horse on a shortcut along the beach, but he lost his way in the fog and was drowned at high tide. Since then, it is said that the frenzied sounds of ghostly hoofbeats have been heard at Gibraltar Point on foggy nights.